In the summer of 1963, a moment arrived that was about to change America forever. This wasn't just another protest, it was a real tipping point, the culmination of years and years of struggle that finally just boiled over onto the national stage. Okay, so let's dive into the story of why the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom absolutely had to happen.
First things first, let's talk about the sheer scale of this thing. On the day of the march, D.C. police figured that over 210,000 people had shown up by just 3 p.m. People at the time, well, they'd never seen anything like it. They called it unprecedented because, honestly, nothing like it had ever happened in the nation's capital. So to really get what could bring that many people together from all over the country, we have to understand the crisis they were all responding to. So this is the big question, right? The one we're going to tackle here. On that specific day, August 28, 1963, why did 250,000 people feel like they had to drop everything and travel to D.C.? What was the spark that lit this incredible fire?
Here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the incredible size of the march, and then we'll rewind a bit to look at the deeply divided nation that made it so necessary. We'll check out the protest strategies they'd been testing, the absolute flashpoint crisis in Birmingham that forced everyone's hand, and then we'll see how the march itself was organized to send this powerful, unified message.
Okay, first, it is so important to remember the event's full official name, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That little word "and," it's everything. See, this wasn't just some abstract call for rights. It was a very concrete demand for economic justice, put together by this amazing coalition of civil rights, labor, and religious groups.
So to really get the why, you have to picture the world of 1963. The march was a direct challenge to a system of racial segregation that was just deeply, deeply entrenched, both by law and by culture, especially in the American South.
And the absolute epicenter of that whole system? Birmingham, Alabama. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King didn't just call it segregated. No, he called it probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. That's a huge claim, right? But he backed it up with cold, hard facts.
Just look at these numbers for a second. The inequality wasn't just social, it was brutally economic. Black unemployment was 2.5 times higher. The average income for black folks was less than half of what white employees made. And think about this. Essential jobs like police officers, firefighters, even bus drivers or bank tellers, completely off limits. And on top of all that, 50 unsolved bombings targeting black leaders in churches. It's no wonder it got that grim nickname, Bombingham. This wasn't just inequality. It was a system held up by economic strangulation and the constant threat of terror.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just a local problem in Birmingham. Across the South, state governments literally adopted a formal strategy called massive resistance just to defy federal court orders to desegregate. This was an organized, official campaign to keep things exactly as they were at any cost.
And this one story shows you the extremes they'd go to. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor actually used the state's own National Guard to physically block 9 black teenagers from walking into a public high school. It got so bad it created a national crisis, and President Eisenhower had to step in, federalize the Guard, and send in the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne just to escort these kids to class.
So when you're facing that level of resistance, what do? Well, civil rights leaders knew they needed a really powerful strategy. For years, they'd been developing and perfecting the tactics of nonviolent protest. The plan wasn't just invented in 1963, it was battle-tested.
And the first huge test of this whole strategy was the Montgomery bus boycott. It all started with a single act of defiance by Rosa Parks in 1955, and it grew into this incredible citywide movement. For 381 days, the black community organized, walking miles to work, setting up these complex carpools. I mean, the discipline and solidarity were just unbelievable.
So here's the bottom line. Montgomery worked. It ended with a Supreme Court decision that struck down bus segregation for good. It proved that large-scale, organized, nonviolent protest could actually beat Jim Crow laws. This became the playbook for everything that came after.
Which brings us right back to Birmingham in early 1963. Activists decided it was time to take that successful Montgomery model and apply it in the most segregated city in the entire country. This was the moment that was going to force a national reckoning.
The campaign was called Project C. The C stood for confrontation. The strategy, as Dr. King put it, was to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. The whole idea was to fill up the jails and grind the city's economy to a halt with sit-ins and marches, basically forcing the white power structure to finally come to the bargaining table.
But as more and more adult volunteers got arrested and thrown in jail, the movement hit a critical point. So organizers made this hugely controversial, really radical decision. They called on the city's children. In what became known as the Children's Crusade, thousands of students, and I mean some as young as 6 years old, marched for freedom, knowing full well they'd probably be arrested. Just an unbelievable act of bravery.
The city's response, ordered by the infamous Bull Connor, was just horrifying. The images were broadcast all over the world, and they showed the shocking contrast. Peaceful kids being blasted with fire hoses so powerful they could strip bark off trees and being attacked by police dogs. That brutality that the world saw in Birmingham created a massive national outcry. Suddenly, this wasn't just some regional issue anymore. It was a national moral crisis. And a crisis that big demanded a national response, a unified demand for action right in the nation's capital. So a powerful coalition of leaders, often called the Big Six, came together to make it all happen. You're looking at the heads of the most important civil rights groups of the era, from Dr. King's SCLC to the student-led SNCC to the old guard NAACP. It was a massive, massive undertaking, all coordinated by the brilliant strategist Bayard Rustin to show the country a truly united front.
And their demands were so concrete. I mean, yes, of course they wanted meaningful civil rights laws and an end to discrimination, but look closer at demands 2 and 3, a massive federal jobs program and a national minimum wage. This just hammers home the point that the fight was for both jobs and freedom.
So, the big question, right? Did it work? Well, the immense pressure created by what happened in Birmingham and then crystallized by that massive, peaceful gathering in Washington had a direct and incredibly powerful impact on federal law.
You can literally draw a straight line. The crisis of 1963 directly paved the way for the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that momentum just kept going, with the marches from Selma to Montgomery in '65 leading right to the Voting Rights Act. The strategy of creating a crisis to demand a response, it had worked, and on a huge national scale.
And that really leaves us with this question. The organizers in 1963, they got it. They understood that you had to transform moral outrage into actual, concrete policy. They built a coalition, they made their demands crystal clear, and they used nonviolent protest to force the issue. The question for us today is, how does that model, that playbook for turning protest into policy, apply to the crises that we face right now?